They all laughed at him. A simple black waiter standing in the corner mocked by a billionaire who thought money meant power. But when the waiter finally opened his mouth, the entire room went silent. What he said next changed everything. The chandeliers glistened like 1,000 captured stars, their light bouncing off crystal glasses and polished silverware. A soft melody from a live string quartet floated through the air, giving the grand ballroom an aura of grace and power. This was no ordinary dinner. It was a gala, an exclusive gathering where the wealthiest and most influential people of the city had come together. A place where fortunes were measured not just in money, but in the ability to command respect with a single glance. At the center of it all sat Jiang Wei, a Chinese billionaire whose name carried weight in international business circles. His rise had been meteoric. From humble beginnings in a small coastal town in Guangdong province, he had clawed his way up the corporate ladder, eventually building an empire in real estate, technology, and finance. His story was often told in newspapers as a tale of perseverance. But those who truly knew him understood another side. A man hardened by his own success, one who had come to believe that wealth not only gave him power, but also the right to look down on others. Jiang Wei leaned back in his chair, his tailored suit hugging his broad shoulders. Around him sat other tycoons, investors, and political figures. They laughed at his jokes, nodded at his comments, and treated him with the kind of deference only reserved for those who held power over their future. The evening progressed with speeches, toasts, and performances. But as the servers began pouring wine, the moment came that would be remembered for years. A tall waiter entered the room carrying a tray with a bottle of red wine. His name was Michael. Dressed in a crisp white shirt with black suspenders, he moved with the calm professionalism of someone who had performed this task countless times. But behind his steady hands and polite smile lay a story most would never imagine. Michael was not an ordinary waiter. Years earlier, he had left his home in Lagos, Nigeria, chasing an education that many in his community could only dream of. He had earned a scholarship to study international relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing, one of the most prestigious institutions in all of Asia. There, he had immersed himself not just in academics, but in culture, language, and philosophy. By the time he graduated, he spoke Mandarin with the fluency of a native and carried the kind of knowledge that could place him in high diplomatic circles. But life had not unfolded as planned. Visa complications, financial struggles, and family responsibilities had forced him into temporary jobs, one of which was serving at this gala. To the world around him, he was just a waiter. But to those who would soon hear him speak, he was something far greater. As Michael approached Jiang Wei's table, he set down the bottle with a respectful nod. "Good evening, sir. Would you like to try our house special wine?" The billionaire glanced up, his eyes narrowing. A smirk played on his lips. His voice, heavy with arrogance, carried across the table. "A black waiter serving wine in a Chinese gala?" he said in Mandarin, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is amusing. I wonder if he even knows the difference between a Bordeaux and a cheap supermarket bottle." The words were sharp, designed not only to wound, but to entertain his audience. The table erupted in laughter, echoing through the hall. Guests chuckled behind their napkins, some shaking their heads in false sympathy, others clapping lightly as though Jiang Wei had delivered a punchline worthy of applause. But Michael did not flinch. His face remained composed, his eyes calm, his posture unshaken. He stood in silence, letting the laughter roll over him like waves against an immovable rock. And then, when the noise began to die down, he leaned slightly forward and replied in flawless Mandarin. 尊敬的张先生，如果您愿意，我可以详细解释这瓶葡萄酒的年份、产地和酿造工艺。Respected Mr. Zhang, if you wish, I can explain in detail the vintage, origin, and winemaking process of this bottle. The hall froze. Every laugh was cut short. Forks paused mid-air. Wine glasses hung suspended in hands. For a long, electric moment, the only sound was the soft music of the quartet in the background. Eyes widened. Whispers began to ripple across the room. People leaned toward one another, asking the same question in hushed voices. Did he just speak Mandarin? Zhang Wei's smirk collapsed. His eyes widened in disbelief, the confidence draining from his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Michael continued, still in Mandarin, his tone polite but commanding. This wine, sir, is a 2012 vintage from a small vineyard in Bordeaux. The grapes were harvested by hand, fermented naturally, and aged in oak barrels for 12 years. It has a smooth finish, with notes of blackberry and oak, a wine chosen for an evening of distinction. The room gasped. Not only did he speak Mandarin, but he spoke with precision, with the elegance of an academic, with the cadence of someone who understood the culture deeply. The very language Zhang Wei had wielded as a weapon had now been used to disarm him completely. For several moments, the ballroom hung in silence. The chandelier lights seemed brighter, the music quieter, as though even the instruments themselves had paused to listen. The billionaire, Zhang Wei, sat frozen in his chair. His chopsticks hovered above his plate, his lips pressed together, his eyes fixed on Michael as though he had seen a ghost. Around him, his colleagues shifted uncomfortably. A few tried to laugh nervously, but the sound quickly died when they realized no one else was joining. It was a strange reversal. Just moments ago, Zhang Wei had been the center of attention, the commanding figure whose words shaped the mood of the room. But now, the spotlight had shifted. All eyes, all whispers, all respect had moved toward the man who only seconds ago had been dismissed as just a waiter. Finally, one of Zhang Wei's associates broke the silence. Leaning slightly toward him, he whispered in Mandarin, but loud enough for others to hear, "Mr. Zhang, he speaks better Mandarin than some of us." The statement, though simple, carried a weight that made Zhang Wei's ears burn. Desperate to regain control, the billionaire cleared his throat. Where did you learn Chinese?" His tone was not commanding anymore. It trembled, with genuine curiosity, perhaps even fear. Michael gave a small bow of respect, his face calm. "In Beijing, sir. I studied international relations at Tsinghua University. 6 years of my life were spent not only mastering the language, but also learning about the culture, history, and people of China. Serving here today is not a career, but a step along my journey. Every role, no matter how small, deserves dignity." Gasps echoed across the table. Several guests leaned back, their eyes darting between Michael and Zhang Wei. The name of Tsinghua University struck them like a hammer. It was not just any institution. It was the pride of China, a place where leaders, presidents, and innovators had studied. To have graduated from there was a mark of intelligence, discipline, and prestige. Zhang Wei's jaw tightened. His pride, the very pride he had flaunted to humiliate Michael, now felt like a fragile mask crumbling in front of him. But Michael was not done. His voice, still gentle, carried the wisdom of someone who had endured ridicule before. Switching back to English for the sake of the international guests, he said, "You see, ladies and gentlemen, the world often teaches us to measure a person by their job title, their skin color, or their wealth. But none of these reveal the true depth of a human being. Every person you meet carries a story, sometimes one filled with struggles, sacrifices, and hidden strength. To dismiss them without knowing that story is not a sign of power. It is a sign of weakness." Murmurs rippled through the tables. A woman in a glittering gown leaned toward her husband and whispered, "He speaks like a professor, not a waiter." Another man, a politician from Singapore, nodded thoughtfully. Such dignity, such composure. Meanwhile, Zhang Wei's mind drifted back to his own past. He had once been poor too. Born in a small fishing village, Jiang Wei had grown up barefoot, his stomach often empty, his nights spent studying under the dim glow of a candle because electricity was a luxury his family could barely afford. As a boy, he had faced humiliation from richer children who mocked his ragged clothes and calloused hands. Back then, he had promised himself that one day he would become so rich, so powerful, that no one would ever dare laugh at him again. And he had succeeded. His rise to billionaire status was the stuff of legends. But in the process, he had forgotten something. He had forgotten what it felt like to be looked down upon. He had forgotten the sting of ridicule. And now, in this moment, facing Michael, those forgotten feelings returned like a storm crashing into his heart. Michael, unaware of Jiang Wei's internal turmoil, continued. When you mocked me, sir, you expected me to shrink, to bow my head in shame. But dignity does not live in the clothes I wear, the job I hold, or the color of my skin. Dignity lives in the choices I make. And tonight, I chose not to answer arrogance with anger, but with knowledge. Because true strength is calm. True wealth is humility. A slow clap began. It started at a table in the back, where a European businessman sat with his wife. Soon, another joined in, and then another. Within seconds, the ballroom filled with applause. Not the polite, obligatory clapping, reserved for speeches, but genuine, heartfelt applause. Jiang Wei's face turned crimson. He forced a smile, pretending to join the laughter. But inside, his pride had been shattered. For the first time in years, he was not the most respected man in the room. And Michael? He did not bask in the applause. He simply nodded once more, refilled Jiang Wei's glass with steady hands, and stepped back with the same grace he had shown since the beginning. To him, it was not about winning or humiliating anyone. It was about dignity. But to everyone else in that room, it was about something much larger. They had just witnessed a lesson, a reminder that respect cannot be bought with money, nor commanded with power. It is earned through humility, wisdom, and kindness. And in that moment, the so-called waiter had become the teacher. The applause eventually faded, but the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of awe. Guests who had moments ago laughed at Jiang Wei's mockery now looked at Michael with respect, some even with admiration in their eyes. Jiang Wei's chest rose and fell heavily. He felt a heat in his face that no wine could explain. His fork trembled slightly in his hand, and though he forced a smile to mask his discomfort, the truth was clear. His arrogance had been stripped bare in front of everyone. But his mind did what it always did when threatened. It ran back into the past. He remembered being a boy, no older than 12, sitting by the docks of his village. His hands were raw from helping his father repair nets, his stomach empty because the catch had been poor. He remembered the wealthy merchant's son who had walked by, dressed in clean clothes, sneering as he tossed him a half-eaten bun, saying, "Here, beggar boy, eat like a dog." The sting of humiliation had burned so deep that young Jiang Wei had clenched his fists and vowed, "One day I will rise. One day I will have so much money that no one will ever mock me again." And he did rise. He built an empire, crushed competitors, and demanded respect wherever he went. But what he never realized, until tonight, was that he had become the very thing he once despised. He had become the man who mocked others to feel powerful. Now, a waiter's calm response in fluent Mandarin had brought those buried memories back to life. As the billionaire sat in silence, others at the table began to turn their attention to Michael. A woman in a silver gown leaned forward. "Young man," she said gently, "your Chinese is remarkable. But more than that, your composure, it's rare. May I ask, why are you here, serving, instead of teaching or leading?" Michael smiled softly. "Life is not always a straight path, madam. Sometimes the journey takes detours. After my graduation, I faced difficulties with visas, family responsibilities back home, and financial struggles. To survive, I took whatever honest work came my way. I do not see this role as beneath me. In fact, every job teaches me something. Tonight I have learned patience, and perhaps I have also been given the chance to remind us all of a lesson about dignity. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. A few guests even murmured in agreement. At another table, a man in a dark suit raised his glass toward Michael. "I admire you," he said simply. One by one, more guests began acknowledging him. Some whispered questions about his studies. Some asked about his time in Beijing. The waiter who had once blended into the background was now at the center of attention, not because of his uniform, but because of his wisdom. Jiang Wei felt the shift acutely. For decades, he had been the magnet in every room, the man others wanted to orbit around, but now the orbit had shifted. People leaned away from him and toward Michael, drawn not by wealth, but by respect. Unable to bear it, Jiang Wei suddenly chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Well," he said in a forced laugh, "it seems our waiter has more degrees than some of our ministers." A few gave polite smiles, but the laughter was thin. The charm he once commanded had evaporated. Everyone saw through it. Michael, however, did not take the bait. He bowed respectfully. "I thank you for your words, sir," he replied calmly, "but degrees alone do not define wisdom. Humility does." That sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples spreading across the room. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. He had been defeated, not by power, not by wealth, not by influence, but by dignity. The gala continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Every time Michael passed through the room, guests greeted him with nods of respect. Some even stood to shake his hand. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer just a waiter. And Jiang Wei, for the first time in his adult life, felt small. He excused himself from the table, muttering about needing some fresh air. He stepped outside to the balcony overlooking the glittering city skyline. The cool night breeze hit his face, but it did little to calm the storm within him. How did this happen? He thought bitterly. How could a waiter, a man I dismissed as nothing, strip me of my pride in front of everyone? But deep inside, another voice whispered, a voice he had long silenced. Perhaps he did not strip you of your pride. Perhaps he reminded you of what you lost, humility. He gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white. Behind him, the sound of soft footsteps approached. Michael had come carrying a tray with 2 glasses of wine. He set it down gently on the table by the balcony and spoke with the same calm tone as before. "Sir," Michael said, "you didn't finish your drink. I thought you might want it." "Here!" Jiang Wei turned, startled. He half expected mockery in Michael's eyes, but found none. There was only calm respect, the same kind that had disarmed him earlier. For a long moment, the 2 men stood in silence under the night sky, one drowning in the weight of his pride, the other steady as a rock, grounded in dignity. And so began a private conversation that neither would ever forget. The city stretched out before them, glittering with lights like a sea of fallen stars. From the balcony, the hum of traffic below mixed faintly with the soft music still echoing from the ballroom inside. Yet out here, the world felt quieter, heavier, as if the night itself was waiting for what was about to be said. Jiang Wei stood with his back to Michael, staring into the distance. His hands gripped the cold railing tightly, as if afraid to let go. He could feel the waiter's presence behind him, calm, steady, patient. It unsettled him more than anger ever could. Finally, Jiang Wei broke the silence. His voice was low, stripped of arrogance. "Why didn't you embarrass me further? You had the chance. Everyone was on your side. You could have humiliated me in front of the entire room." Michael took a step closer but kept a respectful distance. His tone was gentle. "Sir, if I had done that, I would be no different from the one who mocked me. Dignity is not found in revenge. It is found in restraint. The words struck Jiang Wei like a quiet thunder. He turned, his eyes narrowing, not in anger but in confusion. Restraint? Do you know how this world works? Power does not respect restraint. It respects force, wealth, and fear. That is how I built everything I have. Michael met his gaze, unflinching. And yet, sir, you saw tonight what happens when force and wealth meet humility. The room did not cheer for arrogance. They cheered for dignity. Jiang Wei looked away quickly, his jaw tightening. For years, he had silenced the little boy inside him, who once knew what it meant to be humiliated. But Michael's words had torn open the door to memories he had buried. With a sigh, he finally spoke the truth. I grew up poor, Jiang Wei admitted. So poor that some days we had nothing but rice water to drink. I was mocked, spat on, treated like filth. I told myself I would rise so high that no one would ever dare look down on me again. And I did. But in the process, he trailed off, his voice trembling. In the process, I became the very thing I hated. I mocked others to prove I was above them. Tonight, you held up a mirror, and I saw the reflection of a man I don't want to be. Michael listened silently, his expression calm but compassionate. He did not interrupt. After a long pause, he spoke softly. Sir, pain can shape us in two ways. It can make us cruel, or it can make us kind. You chose cruelty, thinking it was strength. But tonight, you have a chance to choose differently. Humility does not erase your power. It magnifies it. Because when a powerful man shows kindness, the world listens. The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Jiang Wei sank into a chair on the balcony, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt small. Not because someone made him feel unworthy, but because he realized how much of himself he had lost. Michael set the tray with the 2 glasses of wine on the small table beside him. He poured one and offered it to Jiang Wei. The billionaire hesitated, then accepted. They clinked glasses softly, not as master and servant, but as 2 men sharing an unspoken truth. Tell me something, Jiang Wei said after a long sip. His voice was quieter now, almost fragile. Why did you choose to learn our language? Why go so deep into a culture not your own? Michael leaned on the railing, gazing at the skyline. Because language is more than words, sir. It is a bridge. It is how we enter another person's world and say, I respect you enough to meet you where you are. When I studied in China, I wanted not just knowledge, but understanding. And in that journey, I discovered something important. The more we understand each other, the less room there is for arrogance and division. Jiang Wei stared at him, stunned. The words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any business lecture he had ever heard. Michael turned back to face him. That is why I did not answer your insult with anger, because I have lived long enough to know that anger only deepens wounds, but respect, even when undeserved, has the power to heal. The billionaire looked down at his glass, his reflection rippling in the dark red wine. For once he had no witty comeback, no sharp remark, no shield of pride. Only silence. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. He realized that tonight was not about being embarrassed by a waiter. It was about being reminded of the man he had once been, and the man he still could be. Inside the ballroom, laughter and music continued. But out here, on the balcony, 2 men from completely different worlds shared a conversation that was far more valuable than all the riches in the room. The billionaire, for the first time in years, felt like a student again, and the waiter, though wearing the uniform of service, stood like a teacher. The night pressed on, but for Jiang Wei, time seemed to move differently. The gala hall was still alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. But the conversation on the balcony lingered in his heart like an echo. He had come to this event expecting admiration, obedience, and flattery. Instead, he had found something he hadn't expected in years, a mirror held up by the very man he had mocked. And in that mirror, he had seen truth. After a long pause, Jiang Wei rose from his chair. He looked at Michael, his face no longer hardened by arrogance but softened by humility. "You've given me something tonight," he said quietly. "Something no business deal, no amount of wealth has ever given me. You reminded me of who I was, and who I must not become again." Michael bowed respectfully. "Then perhaps my service tonight was greater than just pouring wine, sir." The billionaire almost smiled. It was small, uncertain, but genuine. The smile of a man rediscovering something he thought he had lost. Together they walked back inside. The ballroom quieted as Jiang Wei re-entered. All eyes turned toward him. The guests expected the same proud, dominating figure they had always known. But what they saw instead was different. Jiang Wei approached his table, then did something none of them anticipated. He lifted his glass and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm but humble, "tonight I was taught a lesson not by a fellow billionaire, not by a politician or a scholar, but by a man most of us overlooked, a man we saw as a servant. And yet he reminded me, and perhaps all of us, that dignity does not belong to the wealthy. It belongs to every human being." The room grew still. Guests leaned forward, listening intently. He gestured toward Michael. When I mocked him, he had every reason to answer with anger. Instead, he answered with wisdom. He showed me that true power does not lie in wealth or titles, but in humility and respect. Tonight, I stand corrected and grateful. The guests erupted into applause. But this time, it wasn't the polite applause of formality. It was thunderous, heartfelt, and sustained. Michael lowered his gaze, humbled, though his calm smile never faded. He had not sought the spotlight, but it had found him anyway. Jiang Wei turned back to him and extended his hand. Slowly, deliberately. "Forgive me," he said softly. Michael shook his hand firmly. "There is nothing to forgive, sir. Only something to remember." And in that handshake, an invisible weight lifted, not just from the billionaire, but from everyone who had witnessed the moment. The gala continued, but its mood had changed. Laughter returned, but it was warmer, kinder. Conversations flowed, but with more thoughtfulness. And though Michael continued his duties, he was no longer invisible. Everywhere he went, he was greeted with nods of respect, smiles of acknowledgement, and even bows of gratitude. For Jiang Wei, the night became a turning point. He would later tell his closest advisors that the lesson he learned that evening was more valuable than any business strategy he had ever studied. In the weeks and months to come, he began to change, donating more, speaking with humility, treating those beneath him with newfound respect. And as for Michael, he carried on his journey, not defined by the uniform he wore, but by the dignity within him. The world would one day see him rise into the role he was destined for, a leader, a voice, a bridge between cultures. But for everyone in that ballroom, the story of that night would never be forgotten. They would tell it again and again, how a Chinese billionaire mocked a black waiter, and how the waiter, with nothing but wisdom and respect, turned the entire room in his favor. And they would always end with the same lesson. Money can buy luxury, but it cannot buy class. True wealth is measured not by how much you own, but by how much respect you give. The music swelled, the lights shimmered, and as the evening drew to a close, the guests departed with more than just memories of fine wine and glittering chandeliers. They left with a story of arrogance humbled, of dignity restored, and of the undeniable truth that respect has the power to silence even the loudest pride. And so it was, on that unforgettable night, that a billionaire was humbled, a waiter was honored, and an entire room learned a lesson that would echo far beyond those golden walls. Closing narration for dramatic ending. And so remember this: never judge a man by the uniform he wears. Never mock someone for where they stand today, because you do not know the journey they've walked or the wisdom they carry. Arrogance divides, but humility unites. Mockery belittles, but respect elevates. The richest man in the room was silenced not by another billionaire, but by the dignity of the one he underestimated, and perhaps in that truth lies a lesson for all of us.